At 9:59 p.m. on September 30th, 2025, while families in northern Cebu slept beneath shaky roofs, the strongest earthquake in Cebu's history ripped open the earth, exposing a hidden fault no one knew existed. Just 5 weeks later, the same survivors, still trapped under plastic tarps and patchwork camps, were pounded by a deadly typhoon. Hundreds died, thousands more were displaced again, and an entire region was left helpless. What really happens when disaster strikes twice before anyone can recover? At 9:59 p.m., the ground beneath northern Cebu buckled without warning. In Bogo City, families jolted awake as walls rattled and ceilings groaned. The first tremors lasted less than a minute, but in that time, homes crumbled and entire neighborhoods were thrown into chaos. The epicenter lay offshore, just 19 kilometers northeast of Bogo, but the violence of the shaking reached deep inland. It was a magnitude 6.9, stronger than anything recorded in Cebu's history. In San Remigio, the earth's roar drowned out shouts for help. Children clung to parents as floors split open, windows shattered, and blackouts swept through the town. In seconds, concrete blocks tumbled, roofs caved in, and power lines snapped, plunging communities into darkness. Across the region, buildings built to withstand storms proved helpless against the force of the quake. Hospitals filled within the hour, corridors crowded with the injured. Emergency teams scrambled to reach collapsed structures, but roads were cracked and littered with debris. In Bogo, a housing village originally built for Typhoon Haiyan survivors collapsed, killing 10 people. A rockslide in Barangay Binagbag claimed 15 lives. By sunrise, the death toll had reached 79, with more than 1,200 injured across Cebu's northern coast. In the first frantic minutes, no one understood what had caused such devastation. The region had known typhoons, but not this kind of shaking. As aftershocks rippled through the night, a deeper mystery surfaced. The quake had ripped open a previously unmapped fault beneath Bogo Bay. Scientists from FIVOL-CS would soon trace the path of destruction back to this hidden fracture, now named the Bogo Bay Fault. But for the families huddled in the dark, the only certainty was loss. The strongest earthquake in living memory had arrived without warning, and nothing felt safe anymore. In the aftermath of the earthquake, families across northern Cebu found themselves forced out of shattered homes and into whatever shelter they could piece together. In Bogo, San Remigio, Medellin, and Bantayan, open fields and schoolyards transformed overnight into sprawling encampments. The numbers swelled, over 20,000 people, most with nothing but the clothes they wore and what little they could salvage from the rubble. Instead of sturdy tents or solid structures, most families were given nothing more than sheets of plastic. For a family of 5, a single tarpaulin, no bigger than a sheet of plywood, became both roof and wall. The ground beneath was soft with mud, and aftershocks kept everyone on edge. Rows of makeshift shelters stretched across the grass, each one pinned down with rocks, bamboo poles, or whatever could be found. At night, the camps filled with the sounds of restless children and anxious parents. Privacy disappeared. There were no doors, no real walls, just thin plastic flapping in the wind. When it rained, water pooled around sleeping mats, soaking blankets and clothing. Some families dug shallow trenches to keep the water at bay, but the mud always found its way in. Local coordinators tried to keep track of who was where, scribbling names into ledgers as more families arrived. The scale overwhelmed even the most experienced aid workers. In San Remigio, camp leaders described how quickly the tarps wore thin from constant use, how ropes frayed and makeshift anchors failed in the wind. At one camp, a grandmother named Lita gathered her grandchildren under their tarp each night, hoping the plastic would hold until morning. She spoke of the fear that another tremor would send them running again, of the exhaustion from days spent queuing for food or water. The camps offered little protection. With power lines down and no lighting, Women and children moved carefully after dark, wary of unseen hazards. Sanitation was a daily struggle. Latrines were few and far between, and the threat of disease grew with each passing day. For many, the only barrier between themselves and the elements was the fragile sheet of plastic above their heads, a reminder of how quickly disaster can strip away the basics of home, safety, and dignity. In these conditions, the prospect of another storm was unthinkable, yet the sky often threatened rain. Every family knew how vulnerable they had become. At midnight on November 4th, a new terror swept over northern Cebu. Typhoon Kalmaegi, known locally as Tino, struck the coast with winds reaching 114 miles per hour. The storm's arrival was sudden and merciless, coming just 35 days after the earthquake that had already left thousands exposed. For families still living under plastic tarps and makeshift shelters, the warning came too late. Rain hammered the camps, and the wind tore at ropes and bamboo poles, peeling away what little protection remained. In Bantayan, Medellin, San Remigio, and Bogo, the ground turned to mud as floodwaters surged in. What had been open fields and schoolyards became shallow lakes. The water rose so quickly that, within hours, 2/3 of homes in low-lying areas were visible only by their rooftops. People scrambled onto roofs, waving flashlights and pieces of cloth, desperate for help as the current pulled away their belongings. Rescue teams struggled to reach stranded residents. Roads vanished beneath brown water, and bridges that had survived the quake now buckled under the flood. Emergency calls echoed across radio frequencies, each one more urgent than the last. In the darkness, entire families waited on corrugated rooftops, battered by wind and rain, hoping to be found before the water climbed any higher. By the time the storm passed, Kalmaegi had made 8 landfalls across the Visayas. The death toll climbed to 269, making it the deadliest typhoon to strike the Philippines in 2025. For survivors, the disaster was no longer just about shelter or hunger, it was about staying alive as the world around them disappeared beneath the flood. More than 1 million people across the Visayas found their lives upended as the disasters unfolded. In the weeks after the earthquake, the official count of displaced families soared, over 500,000 people forced from their homes by flood, landslide, or the collapse of buildings. The government's own figures put the damage at more than 6.76 billion Philippine pesos, with 134,000 homes damaged and 7,300 completely destroyed. For children, the crisis meant the closure of more than 500 schools across Cebu province, leaving classrooms empty and futures uncertain. Aid organizations raced to respond, but the scale of need quickly outpaced available resources. The Philippine Red Cross, already stretched thin, increased its emergency appeal from 8 million to 18 million Swiss francs in a desperate bid to keep up with shelter, food, and water demands. Yet even as international pledges arrived, many survivors waited days or weeks for help to reach their camps. Humanitarian officials described the situation as a collapse of the basic social contract. Thousands left to fend for themselves under plastic sheets, while government and aid agencies scrambled to restore order. For many in northern Cebu, the disaster revived painful memories of Typhoon Haiyan in 2013. That storm killed more than 6,300 people and left 16 million affected, with 4 million driven from their homes. Housing villages built for Haiyan survivors, meant to be safe havens, were among the first to fail in the earthquake, killing 10 in Bogo alone. President Marcos visited the ruins, confronting the reality that a decade of recovery had been swept away in a single night. Survivors who had rebuilt once before now faced the same questions. How many times can a family start over? And why had the lessons of the past not been enough to keep them safe this time? In the Philippines, disaster isn't an event, it's a cycle. As climate risks and seismic threats intensify, recovery windows shrink and vulnerability grows. The world's most disaster-prone nation stands on a fault line between survival and exhaustion. The next emergency is never far away. What will finally break the cycle?